What is up, people? Today I'll be going over my top 200 favorite Game Boy games, that is, on the original Game Boy in color, which Nintendo themselves likes to group together. So no advance, but my favorite GBA games video may be uploaded by 2047. I've played almost 800 games in this library and finished over 500 of them, so being in the top 200 is actually pretty dang good. I'd recommend you as a viewer to not care too much about the placements of these games though. Ranking 200 games that I've played potentially years apart is actually quite challenging, and you should just view this as simply 200 Game Boy games I recommend. Since I promise you I do actually enjoy every game in this video and think you should probably play them. This video will be in 4 parts at first, each containing 50 titles, just to save space on my computer, but once they're all done I will combine them into one video. And to start out we have Pokemon Picross. You'll see I put 2020 as the release date, but this game never actually released. It was only discovered in 2020, and someone was kind enough to make an English patch for this release, so you yourself should check it out if you're curious. This title was announced in 1999 and was featured in Japanese gaming magazines. They decided not to release it at the time because they had too many Pokemon games releasing in 1999, so it just sat in the vault. Forever, that is. Which is crazy since Jupiter clearly put a good deal of effort into this one. I mean, even the human character sprites are more appealing than those you find in the actual Pokemon games. As you can see, Misty here actually looks like Misty. To be honest, if you're a Picross fanatic, you might be better off going with the developer's other game, Picross 2, which I'm pretty sure is by far the longest Game Boy game if you're actually looking to complete it. As for me though, this one is my favorite of their Picross trilogy, because it's kind of like I'm playing Who's That Pokemon, except not obvious. Next we have Yoshi's Cookie. If you watch my ranking every Yoshi game video, you'll know that the Super Nintendo version of this game is my favorite. To be honest, this is not an ideal way to play this game, although the lack of color isn't why I like other games in this nature, since it does a good job of differentiating the cookies from one another, which if you can't tell, the goal here is to match rows of cookies to feed Yoshi, I think. I mean, I'd hope someone gets to eat them all, but the real reason this is the worst of the 3 versions is because it's by far the slowest when you do end up completing a row, which is very noticeable if you've played the other versions. But all things considered, Yoshi's Cookie on Game Boy is still a decent tile matching puzzle game, even if it's the worst version. I have a confession to make. I'm not really a fan of the Bomberman games, at least the Game Boy ones. I find that all the games just kind of blend together, so if I've played one, it doesn't really give me much of a reason to want to play another. And I quickly grow bored of them because they're really repetitive, but there were 2 Bomberman games that made it onto my top 200, and they're ones that play differently from the rest. The first of these is Pocket Bomberman, which I've only played the Game Boy Color version, but there is an original Game Boy version as well. It combines the traditional Bomberman blowing Schmidt up gameplay with platforming, and you'll quickly find out as I continue this list that I do like platformers, but it works surprisingly well and I didn't really grow bored of this one, nor did I feel like it overstayed its welcome, and it helps that there's a good amount of variety. There's certainly unbalanced difficulty though. I'm pretty sure the last world took me over 50% of the total playtime. Next up we got Astro Rabby, another platformer, but it really plays like nothing else on the system, as it's a top-down auto-scrolling platformer. I mean, the closest game I can think of on Game Boy to this one is Aerostar, which is a shmup where you jump to different heights. Astro Rabby unfortunately has no way of defending himself though. You can only avoid enemies. But yeah, I would have liked this a bit more if you could actually control the pace yourself. And unfortunately there's randomness when it comes to finding the exits in the levels, which is a matter of finding the right question mark block, and if you can't find it the first time through, the level will loop. It can be difficult to judge the height of hazards relative to you, so it's a good thing this game has infinite continues. Otherwise this could have been an infuriating game, but it ends up being a pretty enjoyable ROM. Heisei Tensai Bakabon is the first anime licensed game of many, and you're probably not familiar with this one, unless you happen to be watching this as a 70-year-old Japanese man. The series started out having games on the Master System, NES, Game Boy, and Saturn, before it met its cruel fate of having 3 pachinko games on the PS2. Unfortunately, this is a common fate for many franchises. I think a lot of people are going to be turned off by how slow this game plays, and by the less than stellar music, but I was quite entertained despite being unfamiliar with this work, thanks to all the wacky things I saw in these well-designed levels. And there was a lot of attention to detail with the character animations. This is labeled as a platform game on pretty much every website, but I feel like it's more accurate to call it a puzzle platformer. You can't just blast through this one with good hand-eye coordination, and you'll really need to think about how to approach each level using Bakabon no Papa's capabilities, and he has a lot more than you might expect. And because of that, I found it to be fun despite being a slow-playing game. Jungle no Ouja Ta-chan is another anime licensed game that you probably don't know unless you happen to be a 50-year-old Japanese man. Although you might be surprised to hear that the creator of One Piece worked on this manga as an assistant. It's basically a Tarzan parody. This is also the first Sun L game to appear, and there's a few on this list. They tend to make playable, good looking and sounding games that are generally lacking in polish but have some truly neat ideas. This is one of their more ambitious projects, I think. You got this top-down overworld to explore, which I admittedly don't really care for, to get to the actual 2D levels, but still an interesting combination of gameplay types that you don't really see. You even got an inventory with items to use, and this guy's got a lot of unique abilities to say the least. He can fly by stretching his skin like a flying squirrel, and if you think this looks gross, just know he uses his scrotum in the manga to do this, so could be worse. You can do these fart dive things, which is also pretty gross, and he can turn into a schoolgirl, which makes him faster and slap instead of punch, and I'm not 100% certain, but I think it makes you weaker. You can also rescue various animals and use their abilities to help you progress. I don't think I found nearly all of them, so there seems to be a decent amount of optional content here. This was a good time. I enjoy the graphics and especially music, but unfortunately if you use the schoolgirl power or drink sake, it will change the awesome music to goofy, not so good music, so that's pretty unfortunate. This also has the same problem as other Sun L games, which includes careless enemy placements and a lack of visibility, since the screen follows you when you jump, so you'll often not be able to see what's below you. There's also respawning enemies, and your character has an annoyingly large hurt box. Bet you didn't expect an Adam Sandler game to show up, but you should've. Adam Sandler loves video games after all. That's why he stars in the award-winning movie Pixels. And despite Digital Eclipse being probably the worst Game Boy Color developer in my opinion, who made some insulting conversions of beloved games and questionable original titles as well, they were clearly huge fans of Adam Sandler and knew they had to go all out with this game. Disclaimer, I've never watched this movie, but this title is like nothing else on the system. When it comes to both its design and presentation, with its cutscenes and actual voice acting when you pause the game. Even some of the enemies have voice acting. This is perhaps the most crude game in the library, truly deserving of its T rating. I mean, one of the characters even has head boobs. This is like the Conquer of the library. Shoot! Adam Sandler has a surprising amount of abilities and unique mechanics. I can't even remember them all, but as an example, just one of his abilities is possessing enemies to control them, just like in Avenging Spirit, or for the Zoomer viewers, Mario Odyssey. But my favorite thing about this game is that I really never had any idea of what to expect next. Maybe because I didn't watch the movie, but there's a ton of gameplay variety they throw at you here, and while I don't think it was all executed well, that's why this game isn't higher on this list, I gotta applaud them for being ambitious and creating something very memorable as a result. When I boot up a Game Boy game, I certainly do not expect to encounter enemies who just go around pissing everywhere. I should also mention much of this game looks really freaking good as well much of the time. You could certainly argue this is one of the best looking games in the library. Next up is Tekkaman Blade. Another Sun L game, we did just see one, and this game has the same problems as all of their games, although this is definitely their hardest one, with limited continues and limited room for error. The enemy placements in this game do not take into account your visibility, so I end up falling or jumping onto enemies I didn't see coming. It also doesn't help you can't change direction mid-air after a high jump, so this can be very annoying to deal with. There's also level ups in the game that make you stronger, which I think was the poorest design choice. You'll find something in the levels that increases your level, and it goes up to 3. Being at level 1 is actually a huge disadvantage, especially during boss fights. But these boss fights can be a breeze if you're at level 3. Dropping all the way down to level 1 after dying is also a big punishment, especially when the game doesn't allow you to backtrack to areas where you can find a level up. But this game had me coming back again and again to try and beat it, despite the harsh difficulty, so it's doing something right. This is a game you really have to earn the enjoyment out of by learning the in and outs. Tekkaman has a lot of abilities which can be pretty overwhelming the first time you play this game. I still don't know what they all do despite beating the game, but it can feel pretty good blasting through these levels once you become more accustomed to playing as him, which I forgot to mention this is based off a mecha anime, if that wasn't obvious. One that's a reimagining of the 1975 anime, Tekkaman the Space Knight. But yeah, if you don't believe me that this game can be neat, I recommend you watch Jorf's World Record speedrun, which he's the only guy that's ever speedran this game. It's a bit of a treat to watch due to all the characters' cool abilities. One thing I should mention though is that there's pretty inconsistent difficulty. For me, the final level and boss felt like the easiest. And now here we have Mad Magazine's official Spy vs. Spy for the official original Game Boy. Now in 1999 there would be a Spy vs. Spy game released on the Game Boy Color, a conversion of the Commodore 64 Classic that has a lot of versions. To tell you the truth, I quickly grow bored of that game, as it quickly becomes very repetitive to me. Mad Magazine's official Spy vs. Spy on the other hand, is available only on the Game Boy, and offers quite a bit of variety in its levels, which now features platforming and natural hazards, which are not traps. As you might have guessed, the goal here is to sabotage the rival spy using various traps, while finding the items you need and escaping through the exit before the time is up. But probably the most annoying thing in this game is getting trapped yourself, as you can't move for a whopping 10 seconds. The computer opponent can be a complete joke if you decide to use certain strategies. I always like to bait him into jumping over a pit, only to be greeted by my fist on the other side. Snow Brothers is a room clearing game that I actually prefer over Bubble Bobble. On the NES, that is. This Game Boy version, Snow Brothers Jr., isn't quite as good. It's not nearly as smooth and plays significantly slower than all the other versions of this game, which is extremely apparent if you compare them side by side. I even felt as though my inputs wouldn't register sometimes, and this version seems to be jank as well. Once I died from falling through the ground while snowing an enemy on a slope. There's also annoying things like getting stuck with the only way to escape being waiting out the timer. First time I tried this game out, I game overed and said, I'll stick to the NES version. But years later I gave this another go, and ended up finishing it, and honestly yeah, this is still one of the better games in the library. This version for whatever reason has the most content out of all of them, with an entire new world you must take on after you beat the original game's final boss. This version also gives you a bit of lore every time you clear a world. Kinda neat, I think. Penta Dragon is a game that is very unique that I'm not really sure how to describe. I guess you could sort of make a comparison with Rocky and Pocky, but it's not really that similar. In this top-down shooter you make your way through dungeons, and you have a lot of powers to help you out. You can turn into a dragon for example, but there are times where you even turn into a spaceship. Most of these levels are linear and you just walk forward, but some are not. This game ends up being pretty damn long. This is definitely the longest shmup on Game Boy to do a full run of, but it is quite easy. I don't even know what happens when you die actually, because I didn't die a single time. You've got an enormous health bar and tons of potions in your inventory that you can simply pause the game to use. So yeah, it should be really hard for you to die in this game, which is a good thing considering the length, and honestly, having to replay this would probably be kinda boring. But I think this game is definitely worth checking out at least once. I get the impression their goal with this one was to make you feel really powerful during the 2.5 hour duration, and I think you'll find they succeeded at that, as you go and blast through all sorts of enemies and cool looking bosses. Rainbow Islands is another unique game, although not quite as novel as it exists on many platforms. You could easily skip over this version and play any of the other countless versions instead. However, this does deserve praise for being, at the time at least, the only way to play this game on the go. Now this is actually the sequel to Bubble Bobble, but Fukio Mitsuji didn't want to fall into a rut you see, so not only did you play as entirely different characters here, but the gameplay is also very much changed, as you're not blowing bubbles in this one, but in fact creating rainbows that you not only use as a weapon, but also as platforms. You know what isn't changed though, and you can probably tell if you've been using your ears? The damn music. I went and checked the other versions of this game and they do feature different tunes, but here on Game Boy, it's the Bubble Bobble theme all the way through. What the heck man. Hope you're looking forward to hearing this tune for the entire game, once again. Burai Fighter Deluxe. First thing I'll say that this game has a Game Boy Color version, Space Marauder, or also known as Burai Fighter Color, but you can really go with either one. So this game originally released on the NES, and this Game Boy version came out just 3 months later. I've never played the NES version, but this looks to be basically the same thing, although as you might suspect, due to the screen size you have less room to actually see and avoid things. But this game is a pretty cool and unique shmup, where you play not as a ship, but as a cyborg, who can shoot in just about every direction. This game is a bit of a breeze on the default settings, so pretty easy to recommend to anyone, but it won't give you a very satisfying ending unless you play on max difficulty, which I'm not sure I'd recommend doing, since you do die in just one hit, and like I said, it's pretty dang hard to avoid things because of the screen size. If you're gonna attempt that, it's possible you're better off going with the NES version. While Mario Kart may not have made its way onto the Game Boy or Color, we did get some games like Mario Kart showing that it was definitely possible. But the best of these games in my opinion is Mickey's Speedway USA. It's not at all fair to call this a Mario Kart ripoff however, as this game is by Rare, who created RC Pro-Am back on the NES, which was the game that influenced Mario Kart in the first place. So yeah, Mickey's Speedway USA is more like RC Pro-Am, but for babies like me, okay? I can't get into RC Pro-Am, but I can get into this game. I should also mention this game came out 2 years after another Mickey racing game by Rare, Mickey's Racing Adventure, which is actually more like Diddy Kong's Racing Adventure mode, probably why they chose the name, as it features a hub world and I mean you race between land and water. And you even race bosses. There's a whole lot of stupid puzzles and stuff the game throws at you for no reason though, so even though I do prefer Diddy Kong Racing over Mario Kart, I definitely prefer Mickey's Speedway USA of these two games, as it just sticks to being a standard racing game. But if you're craving more after playing this one, you could always check out the prequel, Saigo no Nindou Ninja Spirit. Ah shoot, I really don't want to talk about this one, because I just talked about it in my video going over my top 15 Game Boy Ninja games, and I may end up talking about it once again when I make a video on short and easy Game Boy games you should play, because that's exactly what this is, short and easy. which likely doesn't reflect the difficulty of the various other versions of this game. I still haven't actually played any other version than this one though. While I do prefer to have some challenge thrown at me, there's a time and a place for both a hard game and an easy game, okay? What makes this game fun is all of your ninja abilities. It makes you feel overpowered. Most notably the Shadow Clones, which pretty clearly inspired those found in Ninja Gaiden 2: The Dark Sword of Chaos, one of my favorite games of all time. There's also a time and place when it comes to playing Santa Claus Jr., which is also short and easy, but if you play this game away from Christmas time, you're kinda weird, man. But I was really not expecting to like a game called Santa Claus Jr. on the Game Boy Color. I mean, have you seen what most of this library looks like? But this game really surprised me with its charm, possibly due to all the details in both the character and background animations, and I mean it's definitely on par with something like Days Before Christmas on the Super Nintendo and Genesis. Just a basic but fun enough platform game that you should really only play around the holiday season. As much as I'd like to say I'm just easy to please when it comes to platformers, most of the platformers on Game Boy and Color I thought were in fact complete utter garbage. An inoffensive, charming, and functional game like this one goes a long way. You might be surprised though, that this game becomes less and less festive and more creepy the more you progress. So while I can be picky when it comes to platformers, when it comes to shmups I think I might be too easily impressed. Because StarHawk here I don't really think is very remarkable. We already saw Penta Dragon a much more unique take on the genre. StarHawk on the other hand is very standard. The most unique thing here is I guess it lets you play as multiple ships. Although I definitely prefer when shmups have more, I guess, level design to them, rather than just being a bunch of enemies and bullets to avoid. So that aspect of this game is appealing to me. Probably my least favorite thing about StarHawk is the unforgiving hurt box of your ship that can make it really hard to avoid things, whether it's enemies or a wall. And these enemies really feel like they take way too many damn hits to destroy. If you're playing this on Game Boy, get ready to mash. But StarHawk is pretty forgiving when it comes to letting you respawn after death, and you can start with as many as 5 lives. But if I tried to 1cc this game, I imagine I'd like it a whole lot less. This may not be the best game for shmup diehards for these reasons, but I enjoyed my time with this one. Also, I think the name StarHawk may have copied the name of another game that just released a few months earlier in the same year. Magic Knight Rayearth is an anime I couldn't really get into, although I will say the opening is fantastic. This series received 2 light RPGs on the Game Boy, but for some reason I've never been able to actually get the second game to work. It won't even start. I was at least able to play the first game though, which has a fully complete English translation, and even though I will be the first to admit I don't play games for story or characters or dialogue, this game had legitimately charming dialogue and characters. I also think this might be the only Game Boy game I've seen that has voice actors in the credits, and these voices were a very nice and unique touch to the game. I also really appreciate the very expressive character portraits. What's also unique is you get to play through any of these 3 girls' stories in any order, with Fu definitely having the longest story, as it makes you traverse a big ol' castle. But I was able to finish the whole game in less than 2 hours. This game definitely reminds me of the short indie RPGs you'll see today that are now common, but back then this was pretty dang unique, and despite not being much of an RPG guy or fan of this anime, I was able to enjoy this. It's really the charm that shines through here, because the game itself, well, you can max out your character's level very fast, and be pretty much unstoppable. But I'm pretty okay with this because I hate when RPGs artificially extend the length of the game, with mandatory grinding which summarizes nearly every RPG back then. Mr. Driller is a game where you drill for 6 minutes until you win. That's right, it's a 6-minute long game, but actually successfully drilling through all 5,000 feet is going to take you a little longer than that. You really need to focus and not make mistakes, watching your oxygen meter and collecting air capsules, while also avoiding getting crushed and trying to go as fast as you can. This originally being an arcade game and a successful run taking only 6 minutes, makes for a great pick-up and play experience that is a perfect fit for a handheld. I don't know how this compares to other versions of the game. I get the feeling it might be easier since it took me only an hour to make it to the bottom, but that's fine by me since any more and I might have grown tired of this. Hunter x Hunter Kindan no Hiho is a game you possibly saw in my Castlevania on the Game Boy video, and that's because I pretty much consider this to be a Castlevania game. It's pretty accurate to call this a Castlevania Metroidvania with a Hunter x Hunter skin, or at least for the main characters. But many of the enemies are just like those you'd see in Castlevania, and there's even candles and Gon has a yo-yo whip. The menus might also look very familiar to you. While Konami didn't make the game, I mean they were too busy making Circle of the Moon, which released less than a month earlier, they did publish it, and that's why there's a weird Yu-Gi-Oh inspired character who appears in all of their Hunter x Hunter games. But honestly, I did enjoy this about as much as titles like Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance. Although I must confess I definitely prefer the classic Vania formula. Unfortunately there's no map in this game, which would have been helpful, but this really feels like the long lost Castlevania on Game Boy Color, and if that sounds appealing you should at least check this one out. Earthworm Jim is one of my favorite games from the 16-bit generation, and at first I didn't really like the Game Boy version too much. It doesn't play quite as well control-wise, and it could be hard to tell what I was looking at some of the time due to the simplified graphics and lack of color. I could hardly tell where the hooks were to swing on in What the Heck. But I gave it another go, and I think it's an acceptable adaptation of the game, far from the 16-bit version in terms of quality though, and it should be mentioned that there's cut content, unsurprisingly. But to be honest, when it comes to 8-bit Earthworm Jim, you're probably better off going with the Game Gear version, which looks and plays the exact same but has color. Pretty nice colors actually, adding some much needed clarity. What's impressive about both of these is that they're actually more accurate to the original game than the GBA version, despite that using actual assets from the original game. In comparison, it feels like the GBA game didn't even really try. I also can't recommend the Brazil exclusive Sega Master System version, which may look similar but the playability is worse, being painfully slow, and this version cuts out even more content with 2 more missing levels. All of the games mentioned certainly beat the Game Boy Color sequel, Earthworm Jim Menace to the Galaxy, where they for some reason turned Earthworm Jim into an absolutely dreadful collectathon. Just why? World Heroes 2 Jet. I have to admit I'm unfamiliar with this game's original arcade or Neo Geo versions. I've only played it here on Game Boy, which besides Neo Geo is the only thing it actually released on. This game was developed by B-Top, who you might know also did Innsmouth no Yakata, a game I consider to be in the top 10 of the Virtual Boy library. Pretty impressive, right? Well, I can tell that this game is probably really good in the arcades and on Neo Geo, since this Game Boy version still manages to be enjoyable, featuring an impressive roster size with very distinct characters. I mean, just look at this guy Mudman. This may not be the best fighting game on Game Boy, but far from the worst. I actually didn't like B-Top's other Game Boy game fighting game effort, Samurai Showdown 3, which is possibly because I'm familiar with the other versions of that game. I think the playability of this title could have been improved, and we will see examples of pretty great fighting games later on in this list, but for being the first fighting game to make an appearance, this one's not too shabby. Rayman 2 The Great Escape, you might have heard, is actually one of the most classic 3D platformers of all time, but here on Game Boy Color it's actually a 2D game, and I think it's safe to say this is the worst version of the game, but at the same time the most unique. In Europe it's actually known as Rayman 2 Forever, although it features the same premise as its 3D counterpart, but this is actually a sequel to Rayman 1 on GBC which we have yet to see on this list. Maybe it'll show up eventually, who knows? So I think the Rayman Game Boy Color games have good core gameplay. I mean, this dude definitely plays like Rayman, and can do everything you'd expect. And the level design is acceptable, but not nearly as imaginative as the Rayman levels you'll encounter on superior hardware. And the visuals are decent, particularly the animations. These Game Boy Color Rayman games are absolutely not going to knock your socks off, but for what they are, they're pretty good. My biggest problem with these games, though, is the dreadful music that actually hurts my ears to listen to, and dampens the whole experience. The boss fights are also, not sure I'd even consider these boss fights actually. Everyone knows the classic Felix the Cat on NES, which also got a Game Boy version, but few talk about Baby Felix, which I guess is an anime. I sure as heck had never heard about it before, and I have no idea how popular it was. And I also don't know what the deal is with all these animated series that feel the need to have a baby version. Is it goal to attract baby viewers? Well, now they all just watch Cocomelon on YouTube.com. This is the first Bit Manager's game to make an appearance, and you can always count on their Game Boy games featuring impressive animations, but more notably, excellent music by Alberto Jose Gonzalez, who co-founded Bit Managers. I get the feeling the real reason all their games existed was just so that he could compose some awesome chiptune music. Their games can also tend to be frustrating when it comes to the controls, usually as a result of all the animation frames, and for simply being difficult. As you might expect though, Baby Felix is pretty light on difficulty, probably because it's for babies. Again, I'm just guessing, I don't know who the target audience for Baby Felix is. Which, I guess I should mention this is a Halloween game. Yeah, the second holiday game to appear, and one of the 2 Halloween games on the Game Boy Color. Yeah, there's not nearly as many Halloween games as there are Christmas games, but I like to see it nonetheless. Only the first world is Halloween themed though, and the rest range from prehistoric to outer space. Anyway, the main reason this game is Halloween themed despite releasing 6 days before Christmas is to explain Baby Felix and Baby Kitty's abilities. Yeah, there's 2 playable characters, but disappointingly they don't actually play different from each other. This game may not reach the heights of Felix's other 8-bit adventure, which may or may not show up later, but regardless, what a damn shame it wasn't put in the Felix the Cat collection. It would have been slightly less of a massive ripoff, but I guess because it's not a Konami game it wasn't included. I also learned there's Baby Felix Tennis on the PS1. Just why? Spanky's quest is the first Natsume game to make an appearance, and as you might be able to guess, that means this game features a great overall presentation with its graphics and music. The composer of this game, Hiroyuki Iwatsuki, was also responsible for what is, in my opinion, the best soundtrack on the Game Boy with Ninja Gaiden Shadow. And actually, the staff of this game is still working with each other to this day as Tango Project, which I think is my favorite development team that exists today. Spanky's quest is a room clearing game like Bubble Bobble, for example, where you play as a monkey and bounce a bubble on your head to make it bigger and more powerful, allowing you to kill more enemies at a time. Now there's probably people who think this is one of the absolute best games on the system, but I found it got repetitive pretty quickly, and overall it plays a little too slow for my liking. Some might consider this a straight action game, but I lean towards it being an action puzzle game, since you do need to think to clear some of these rooms. Think about how you're actually going to hit these enemies with your bubble. This game is definitely a good fit for the handheld, with its password system making it one you can pick up and play easily, but I think what really elevates this one is its raw charm factor that you just can't deny. Speaking of puzzle games, we've got Kirby's Star Stacker. Back when Kirby was getting all sorts of spin-off games on the Game Boy, because Kirby's Dream Land sold 5 million copies. And it would take 30 years for a Kirby game to sell more, with Kirby and the Forgotten Land, very deserving by the way. But most of these Kirby spin-offs, guys, I'm gonna be honest, I don't like too much. But it's hard for me to go wrong with a falling block game when executed well, compared to pinball, blockout, or mini golf, genres I don't care for very much. Basically, you gotta sandwich these stars between two matching blocks, which are 3 of Kirby's animal buddies, then the stars disappear. Pretty simple, but I think the Kirby presentation, I mean this game is made by HAL, really goes a long way to make it more enjoyable. It plays well and there's a lot of charm. And also content. It's got a versus mode, challenge mode, and time attack mode, as well as round clear, which has a whopping 5 difficulties, going all the way up to insane. So if you really want to experience all this game has to offer, it'll keep you busy for quite some time. I should probably mention this game also got a remake on the Super Nintendo. Rayman. Ah shoot! Now I have to somehow explain why this is 4 spots higher than Rayman 2 despite having identical gameplay. Well, I've never played the original Rayman 1, although I really ought to, so I can't really comment on how it compares to that game, but it should be a much closer adaptation seeing as they're both 2D. From my understanding though, this game is much shorter and significantly easier than the original. This game also shares music with Rayman 2 strangely enough, but why I overall prefer it slightly over that game is because this game is more vibrant since it's based on a more colorful game, and the content is slightly better in my opinion, with Dark Rayman inverted controls and these trumpet levels. Rayman 2's levels, on the other hand, will want you to press switches for laser doors you can just damage boost through anyway. Unfortunately, Rayman 1 has all the same strengths and weaknesses as Rayman 2 on Game Boy Color, so I don't have much left to say about this one. Marble Madness is one of my favorite NES games. I even made a Marble Madness inspired game for school once, and the game received an acceptable adaptation on the Game Boy, but understandably some people are not keen on it. It's missing the final level and the ending has been removed, so the game just loops over and over. The game is also significantly easier since the time is more forgiving, and the physics are solid but kind of odd, allowing the marble to go really fast at times. If you know you can press A or B to go faster, you'll be able to get through this one very easily. The physics and speed make this version more appealing to speedrun, being the second most popular. The presentation is also as good as I could expect, for both the sound and music, feeling very close to the NES version. But honestly, anyone who thinks this version of Marble Madness sucks should stay far, far away from the version on Game Boy Color by Digital Eclipse that has horrible music, controls, and I often get stuck on things for no reason. Truly one of the worst conversions I've ever experienced for a game. Marble Madness on Game Boy did a much better 8 years earlier. Qix Adventure is a weird one. Pokemon gave the Game Boy a second life, which resulted in Nintendo creating the Game Boy Color, and that library consisted of too many monster catching games to count that tried to capitalize on Pokemon's massive popularity. Many of these games were not even RPGs, including Qix here, which was already an almost 20-year-old game by this point. They just put these monsters on the cover to try and trick a new generation into buying this classic, and honestly it's way better than the Qix that appeared on the original Game Boy in my opinion. The game plays a whole lot faster and smoother, and even has music instead of silence. But there's a lot that confuses me about this game. There's things like treasure to collect, but it seems like there's little reason to do this. It adds to your currency, but I couldn't find a way to buy something. There's also unique treasures, which I guess are for completionists or something. And there's apparently items in this game, but I didn't pick up a single item somehow in my entire playthrough. As far as I can tell, there's no way to get extra lives in this game either. You have 3 all the way through, and you'll lose a life if you simply take damage. So it's wise to reset after dying at some points, so you don't have to play through the entire game with 1 life and 1 hit death. I figured there would be a way to buy extra lives, but I couldn't find a way. And I also unfortunately couldn't find a manual for this game. It's an obscure one. You'll notice that I didn't talk much about the monsters in this game, and that's because they don't really matter much. They're kinda just there. You talk to them once, then you play the level, and you try and draw around them to murder them. The game didn't seem to get harder as I went on. It mostly felt like I just needed to rely on good Qix behavior RNG in order to progress. The Qix is the colorful sticks enemy you're seeing there if you didn't know, by the way. There's a lot of confusing aspects, but at the end of the day, this is a better way to play Qix than the one on the original Game Boy in my eyes. Parasol Henbee is yet another boomer anime manga series sharing the same creator as Doraemon, although it doesn't date that far back, debuting in the late 80s and early 90s. It received this Japan-exclusive cutesy platformer on the Game Boy that I think is pretty fun. It's a unique playing game with Henbee's parasol abilities that allow him to stall or float in the air, although the floating will drain his health. And he has a tornado ability that is quite similar to Kirby's, the difference being this also drains his health, which you can recover from all the food scattered throughout the levels. Most of these levels have 2 different planes you can move between, which is very unique and I haven't really seen it elsewhere. And there's sometimes even a background you can move to as well. This creates more distinct level designs and allows the game to stand out from other generic platformers in the library, and it helps that there's good variety in these levels, with new enemies and obstacles to see throughout, and various settings like towns, skies, caves, and forests. It's a pretty short game, but not as easy as you might expect. Even though it gives you a lot of lives, there are limited continues and plenty of things to catch you off guard in the later stages. This game's not going to knock your socks off, which is why it's only 171st on the list, but I think it's one certainly worth checking out at the very least. Tintin Prisoners of the Sun is my favorite of the 2 Tintin games on Game Boy, which appeared both on the Game Boy and Color, but I've only played the color versions for both. The other game, Tintin in Tibet, I found to be a bit more annoying with its level design and puzzles, but Prisoners of the Sun is a pretty straightforward platformer, with some gameplay variety thrown in that's actually surprisingly enjoyable to play. I know pretty much nothing about the Tintin IP itself, but I had no problem enjoying the excellent music and great graphics here that you'd expect from a bit manager's game on Game Boy. Really the deal breaker for me with this developer is if the game is annoyingly designed, which is often made even worse by the characters having a lot of animation frames, making them feel sluggish and unresponsive to control, but this game ended up being pretty enjoyable throughout and definitely deserves to be here on this list. Popeye 2, and I'm gonna be honest with you, Popeye 1 on Game Boy is flat out one of the worst games I've ever played. A maze game that is completely RNG based, didn't quite make the top 200, as it currently sits at 519th on my Game Boy ranking. This game is so bad that it never even made it to the United States, Popeye's country of origin, and remains a Japan exclusive title just like Garfield on Famicom. But they were able to get away with releasing Popeye 2 outside of Japan while keeping the name, because consumers probably just thought it's a sequel to Nintendo's Popeye. And this game definitely shares more similarities to that title, seeing as they are both platformers, or so I'm told. You can't actually jump into the first game, but anyway. As a fan of Nintendo's Popeye, I can say this is actually a pretty worthy sequel. Starting out, you'll probably immediately think, wow, this is basically Super Mario Land but with Popeye, but the levels in this game kind of fall off pretty fast. I'm not saying this simply because they stop being straightforward left to right levels, but these levels with walls, ceilings, and lots of rope all around you create a ton of slowdown and add choppiness. The controls also start feeling unresponsive. I mean, I'm pretty sure my inputs don't even register at times, and it just feels all around worse to play, and you'll probably encounter other jank, like getting stuck in walls for a split second. This is, I think, really unfortunate, because in the first level of the game, Popeye feels quick, smooth, and responsive, and I wish they stuck to making a Super Mario Land clone. So this sounds pretty negative, but why do I like this game? Well, Popeye himself is pretty fun to play as, especially when you're all powered up and chucking spinach. Yeah, I know, kind of a weird attack for him to do, but it's actually very vital to his arsenal, as if you don't have it, you'll have to punch everything, and the hitboxes are really not doing you any favors. Popeye really doesn't have much reach, especially in his base form, which you'll probably be in often, because he loses his powers if he takes damage. His base form is actually a big disadvantage, particularly in boss fights, and can make them kinda dreadful to play, as they are a very easy way to lose a ton of lives. This game having limited continues really annoyed me at first, mainly due to all the problems I've mentioned, but this game really does get better the more you get used to it. There's just sadly a lot of missed potential that would have put it much higher on this list. The background music could definitely use some improvement as well. Ultimately, I still had fun, and it might be the best Popeye game I've played to this day. Next up is Penguin Wars, or King of the Zoo depending on the region, which admittedly is a more accurate title, because you can play as a whole lot more than just penguins in this game, and this is a rare sports game to appear. Not a genre I claim to care about, but there's still a few on my list. This is my favorite dodgeball game on Game Boy, and believe it or not, it's got some competition. Yeah, unfortunately Kunio Dodgeball didn't really deliver on the Game Boy, a game I adore on the NES. This game's version on the Famicom on the other hand, Penguin Wars, I think is BS and I hate, but I ended up liking this Game Boy version enough to rip it off by recreating it in Unity for a college assignment once upon a time. My favorite thing about this game is probably comboing your opponent, which you can pull off because they have quite a bit of hit stun after getting hit. The goal is to get all the dodgeballs to the other side, and you can potentially get all 10 on the other side during a combo, which is pretty satisfying to pull off, although it's very painful being on the receiving end. Now, to the surprise of me and maybe pretty much everyone else who has ever played this game, there is actually an ending to this. I had no idea. I thought this game just looped endlessly, but beating level 40 will end the game. The only footage I could find of this was a guy who played this game for 43 hours, but ended up deciding to use a hidden save select code to get to the end. so it's possible no one on the entire planet has actually beaten this game, not even the likes of Billy Mitchell. Quick update, since a couple months have probably passed since I edited this part, but someone did actually end up beating this game legit. Wax Weasler, who's on a quest to beat 1000 Game Boy games. Go check him out if you want. Apparently the opponents get ridiculously hard around the level 20 mark, and start basically cheating by decreasing their hit stun and increasing their speed, while the player remains the same. For beating the game you will see the credits and be called a great player, but you get called an excellent player for beating one loop. You tell me which is better. Bit Managers is back again just a few entries later with the Smurfs. Infogrames released 4 Smurfs Game Boy games on Game Boy and Color, but this is easily my favorite. Probably because it's the only one with an NES counterpart, and NES era game design is my favorite because they tend to be straightforward action games. The other Smurfs on Game Boys are more exploratory, and as a result I just find them boring and not very fun. I really don't consider myself to be a fan of exploration-based platformers, so don't expect to see many on my list. Unsurprisingly, this game has really great music, and the gameplay is more than serviceable. You'll have to trust me on this one because the frame rate in the footage I have is quite low. Overall, the game provides a decent enough challenge, and the platforming levels are a good time, although I'm not a fan of the sled level, and the final boss fight feels especially bad on Game Boy, because you have much less time and space to avoid Gargamel on the Game Boy's small screen. Lock and Chase is exactly what I want to see when an arcade game gets brought to Game Boy. The original game was already 9 years old at the time of this release, and had they tried to make an accurate conversion of that game, it would have been just as depressing as all the other Game Boy conversions of early 80s arcade games, which tend to be lesser experiences due to the Game Boy's limitations. I mean, with the small screen especially, there's only so much you can do in trying to adapt an arcade game as accurately as possible, and even by imitating the graphics, it'll likely end up looking even more primitive on the handheld. These titles often feel very bare bones as well, since you're paying potentially full price for a game that you usually just plop a quarter in to play for a few minutes. To make these conversions feel less bare bones, they'd often release them as collections instead, which still usually ended up being depressing. Data was able to make Lock and Chase stand out from the rest by making it a fully realized game on the Game Boy with a set number of levels and an ending, which was absolutely the right choice. I don't really think anyone likes or cares about Game Boy's version of Pac-Man, so what business would a conversion of a Pac-Man wannabe have on the platform? Unfortunately, there aren't many games like Lock and Chase in the library that decided to be a fresh reimagining of an old arcade classic, although Data East did do the same thing with their other classic Burger Time with the release Burger Time Deluxe. I just don't like it as much, so it's not on my list. But you have to applaud Data East for actually putting care into these titles. Would have been nice to see Namco do the same thing with Pac-Man, or Konami with Frogger, but yeah, those games unfortunately probably sold more than anything Data East released anyway. But which of these Game Boy games are actually still remembered to this day? We can also expect to see a game later down the line by Nintendo that I think we all know and love. I have not watched Macross 7, although maybe I ought to, but I have at least played the Game Boy Color game, because I made sure to play every shmup in this library, which there's actually not that many, and the majority are in this very video, at least when I upload the fully complete version that is. In this game you get to choose a team of 3 characters of 6 total available, and you can switch between them on the fly, which is pretty neat. The main reason it's useful to switch is because each character has a different health bar, so if you're about to explode, it's wise to switch to a different mech. You can pick 3 different modes for your mecha, each with different hitboxes and projectiles. This all sounds neat, but the game could have used better, more engaging levels. But I feel they weren't really trying to appeal to shmup diehards, but mostly to Macross 7 fans, which is apparent when noticing half the screen contains character portraits and dialogue, which definitely limits the levels themselves by having even less space to work with on the Game Boy's already small screen. It's just not nearly as tightly designed as the best shmups on the platform. They were concerned only with being a shmup, and as a result diehards of this genre, who aren't a fan of this IP, might simply not care for this title with this low challenge and forgettable levels. I don't even remember what the power-ups do in this game, to be honest. What is very memorable about this game though are the boss battles. This is where the game becomes a shmup and rhythm game hybrid. You heard that correctly. You need to multitask by dodging bullets on the top screen while timing button presses to the rhythm of the music in the background. Playing this for the first time was definitely confusing at first, especially when there's basically no visual feedback that you'd expect when hitting or missing notes in a rhythm game, but you'll be able to tell when you're successful when the boss's HP goes down. But this is actually quite engaging and very unique. I've never seen this elsewhere. It's almost like you're playing 2 games at once. If you needed any more proof, this is made specifically for Macross 7 fans. Apparently it's like this because you're playing as characters in a band, and in the anime, they use rock music as a form of connection to defeat aliens. Banishing Racer was a game I knew I needed to play when I first saw its adorable graphics, with this very expressive car fella. This game was made by Jalico, and something I didn't even think about till now is that they already had experience creating a car platforming game. Some would call this the carformer genre. Not that these 2 games share any of the same staff, but it's not crazy to assume City Connection was what inspired this game in the first place. What I didn't expect going into this one though, was that the game would be hard as balls. It's not the hardest game in the library thanks to having unlimited continues, like Ghosts and Goblins for example, but Unlike Ghosts and Goblins, you die in one hit, not two, and you don't have any sort of weapon to defend yourself. You can only defeat enemies by jumping on them, which of course requires precision so that you don't die in the process. Basically what I'm trying to say is that this game is harder than Ghosts and Goblins, which might have hindered my enjoyment of this title, despite its cute graphics and nice variety, though I'm not sure how the water level is supposed to be enjoyable to anyone. It doesn't even contain music, and if I had to guess, it's just here to show off the wavy water effect, which does look nice. I guess this level can also be seen as a breather before you get thrown right back into the chaos. I enjoy a challenging game, but I'm not sure the gameplay here is interesting enough to carry the experience. Like I said, you're just jumping through, pressing the B button you can get speed boosts, and by jumping on 4 enemies in a row you'll be rewarded with an extra life. The game's pretty hard right off the bat, but there are definitely difficulty spikes, particularly with World 5 and its auto-scrolling level, the final level of the game. For auto-scroll level haters like myself, this just feels especially evil, and this is no doubt one of the hardest levels on the Game Boy period. One mistake is all it takes for you to have to redo the whole thing, and there's so many possible ways for you to die. If this game just had 2-hit death, I could see it being higher on my list. Even if you like this game for allowing you to blast through the levels once you've reached a certain level of mastery, you'll still have to endure the very slow water and auto-scroll levels. Probably the most egregious thing about this game is that there's no saving or password. I can imagine many kids made it deep into this one, only to be forced to stop playing because they had to go to school or something, or they reached their final destination on a car trip, or maybe their batteries died. Brutal. Pocket Puyo Puyo-san. This game came as a pleasant surprise for me, because I did not like the original Game Boy's Puyo Puyo games. Most because, well, I mean look at it, I can hardly distinguish the different colors of Puyo. This added a lot of extra frustration against computer opponents, who are already quite challenging. You gotta think this is probably the least desirable way to play Puyo Puyo, especially because it already appeared first on the Game Gear in color. But Puyo Puyo would later redeem itself on the Game Boy Color, by, as you guessed, actually having color this time around. But it's also cool that this game features 3 different difficulties that act as 3 different stories you can play through, each focusing on a different character, all with a unique ending. I definitely prefer this game's sequel, which also released on color, but you can't go wrong with this title either. And here we have one of the only light gun games on this list, The Punisher. Before this, Beam Software released a rail shooter, The Punisher, on NES. I have not played this game, but I did happen to notice that there's no music in the gameplay I watched, which is a huge deal breaker for me when it comes to video games. I mean, it's probably a top 3 most valuable thing for me in the art form, and I finished some truly terrible games only because I enjoyed the music I was hearing. Beam Software also released T2 the arcade game on the system, another light gun shooter with no music, and no music is primarily why I wrote this game off. The original arcade game may not have music, but they still made sure to include it for the Genesis, Super Nintendo, and even Game Gear versions. I didn't even write off the light gun aspect of this game though, but I was definitely skeptical. But The Punisher shows that you can indeed make this genre work on Game Boy. Thankfully it includes music, but it's also just a well-designed title that doesn't try to cheat you with unforeseeable death, as many games in the genre do. And it takes into account that you're playing with a Game Boy D-pad and not a real light gun. Don't get it twisted though, most people are going to find this game to be quite challenging. It's definitely advantageous knowing what to expect when going into a level or boss fight, but it's also possible to do fine if you're just paying attention. How I get through this one is just by shooting everything I can see in the environment, hoping that it'll drop some valuable life or ammo, and this game has a lot of attention to detail for what is actually destructible in the environment. If you can see it, there's a good chance you can shoot it and something will actually happen, even with these poor ducklings. Wayne's World. Now I can't lie to you by claiming this game is good, but I also can't lie to you by saying I didn't enjoy it. It's probably the greatest guilty pleasure for me in the library, and I can't really think of anything else that comes close, because I think you can at least see what might be the appeal of most games on here, even ones that you personally aren't a fan of. I've seen this movie, but seeing as I haven't watched it in well over a decade, I don't really care about it, so that has little to do with my enjoyment here. I was really only intending to try this one out. I figured it would be bad and I'd quickly drop the game, but actually, I couldn't stop playing until I beat it. And I mean, do you know how many Western developed movie tie-in games on this platform I brought myself to actually finish? Not many at all. So this game must have done something right, and I didn't just finish it because it's super easy or whatever. It actually offers a decent challenge, mostly because there's limited continues, and you'll probably experience some BS deaths, I know I did. So it does take a bit of effort to actually finish, which I think made me more engaged. As Wayne, you've got kung fu abilities, although you'll probably find that it's hard to actually hit anything, especially the small enemies, but you are actually able to combo enemies by abusing their hit stun. You know, there's that short game Kung Fu Master that I'm sure people might consider an all-time classic in this library, but I'm not a big fan of this one, to be honest. I don't even like the NES Kung Fu very much either, although I am a fan of its sequel Spartan X2 on the Famicom, but we all have our own unique opinions when it comes to video games. While some people's ideal short Kung Fu adventure on the Game Boy is Kung Fu Master, for me I guess it's Wayne's World. Although for the other half of this game when you're playing as Garth, it plays more like a run and gun. So yeah, there's a decent bit of variety when it comes to not only the gameplay, but also the levels. One moment you're shooting instruments, the next moment you're being attacked by ninjas, and before you know it, the controls completely switch on you. No, really, I was not expecting this game to have two different types of jumps, depending on the direction you're facing. If you're jumping when facing left, the distance is greatly reduced, which makes for some of the least intuitive controls I've experienced in a game, and it definitely led to death and frustration at first. If I had to guess, it's only like this to make these stairs actually work, which I guess that was easier than programming stairs you can actually walk up. But at that point, why even keep them? I mean, when Castlevania couldn't do stairs on Game Boy, they just put ropes in instead. I haven't played the NES version of Wayne's World, but from what I can tell, it looks to be mostly the same game. But this version opted to completely get rid of the stairs, which makes their inclusion on Game Boy all the more baffling, especially when both games release at the same time. And the NES is supposedly the console that can actually handle stairs. So yeah, this is not a very good game, but like I said, I'm not gonna pretend I didn't enjoy it. I can't help it, I guess. I have a confession, which is that I don't like the original R-Type on the Game Boy. I'm not sure how controversial of a statement this is, considering this version wasn't even developed by IREM, but was instead handled by a British studio, Bit Studios, who made mostly questionable games. I found the ship in R-Type was too damn big and slow, and the levels came down entirely to memorization, from knowing exactly where on the screen you can't get hit. Limited continues also makes it even less appealing. My main experience with this one was in R-Type DX though, and I initially wrote off R-Type 2 as well because R-Type DX has disappearing bullets, which is about the last thing you want in a shmup. For some reason the reviews of this game don't mention this though, almost as if they didn't actually play the game or something, because they're game journalists. The color job also seemed to ruin some visual feedback that the bosses are supposed to display when you hit them, so it's hard to tell if you're even damaging them at times, if you're unfamiliar with the original games. So R-Type DX I also can't really recommend, even though it also includes both the original versions. I think you're much better off going with R-Type 2 by itself on the original Game Boy, which is a perfectly decent shmup, so I'm glad I ended up checking out the original version. God Medicine Fantasy Sekai no Tanjo is an RPG by Konami Computer Entertainment Nagoya, who you might know created all kinds of bad Game Boy games, most notably Castlevania Legends, which was a lot worse than Belmont's Revenge, which released 6 years earlier on the platform, as well as Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, which was significantly worse than the Goemon game Konami released also 6 years earlier, and these two releases were just a week apart from each other by the same developer, so I get the feeling they were rushed. But God Medicine came out 4 years before those titles, so it's safe to say they don't share the same staff. This game actually shares more staff with Konami's earlier Game Boy titles, such as Nemesis Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Cave Noir, the original Goemon, and Tiny Toon Adventures, so back when Konami was releasing mostly good games for the system, instead of a bunch of rushed garbage to capitalize on Game Boy's newfound popularity due to Pokemon. So yeah, despite technically being a Keisuya Nagoya game, it's really just a Konami Game Boy title, and Konami is probably my pick for best overall Game Boy developer, despite their later fall off. They have more games than any developer on my top 200 by far, with a slight asterisk, because I do have spots that share some titles, but I'll get to that much later. But as someone who would never claim to like RPGs overall, I do believe God Medicine has that Konami quality, as even I was able to enjoy the game. The story is that 3 RPG fans inherit the powers of fallen heroes, and enter the game that was to be released, Phantom, to save its world and to stop a demon from further threatening reality. The same demon that destroyed the company that created Phantom. So yeah, you need to go back and forth between these two worlds on your quest. And yeah, this was basically an isekai before it was a formal marketing genre. It was probably just labeled under fantasy back then, which is in the game's name. Although I'll be the first to admit I don't really care about stories in games, I did think the battling and exploration was adequately fun, although there are a lot of random encounters just like, well, every RPG during that time. It is obviously a Japan exclusive title, but there does exist an English fan translation, so likely everyone watching can play and enjoy this today. Rockin' Monster is a pretty good falling block puzzle game, believe it or not. I say that because the most viewed video on YouTube for this has only 500 views, being the soundtrack, and the game's rockin' music really did help to elevate the experience, although it's just one music track during actual gameplay. Blocks themselves are rather unappealing. I mean, I don't really know what I'm even looking at, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know what the blocks are supposed to be, and I guess they look like this due to the limited color palette on the Game Boy, but I mean it does make it easier to follow than something like Puyo Puyo without color. And like Puyo Puyo 2 on Game Boy, it's got Super Game Boy enhancements, which looks nice. You clear blocks to battle against expressive chickens and dragons, and the game itself gets to be pretty dang fast, with the level of speed constantly increasing even if you lose, which can make it rather challenging, but I still managed to beat it and it was a fun time, which ultimately is the most important thing for me, even if I'm aware that what I'm playing is a bit uninspired. But for me at least, it ended up being more appealing than the original Game Boy Puyo Puyo games, which is likely what it was ripping off the most, so gotta give it props for surpassing its inspiration on this platform at least. Booby Boys. Now don't get too excited. The title is referring to booby traps, which are these holes you dig to trap and kill enemies. So yeah, quite similar to Heiankyo Alien, but this game is like that on steroids, with way more variety in its levels with 6 different areas you can select in any order for a grand total of 60 levels, the goal being to go around and locate all the chests so that a key appears, allowing you to advance further. With the spade power-up, you're able to dig as many as 5 holes at once, and you can also pick up a laser gun, something especially useful for boss fights since they're too damn big to dig a hole for. This is a super underrated, albeit flawed game for the system. One thing that really annoyed me during boss battles is that you only have 1 to 2 tiles to see what's below you, and I could really use that visibility so that I can see the enemies spawning in and approaching me. And without the running shoes you can pick up, I have no idea how you're supposed to dodge these bosses, especially the later ones. Even after picking up the running shoes though, I'm not a big fan of the controls. It feels unresponsive and turning without moving can be a bit tricky. Unfortunately, you can only move in 4 directions, which works great for the levels, but for the boss fights, which are open areas, it feels like you should be able to move in a lot more directions. This is a problem I have with a lot of top-down boss fights in Game Boy games. Fortunately, Link's Awakening, which released just a few weeks prior to this game, would get it right. One weird design choice is that to dig holes you press B, but using a weapon you press A, which can throw you off if you're used to pressing the B button. You can't even dig holes while using a weapon, so I'm not sure why they didn't make the weapon button also B. Guess they felt obligated to use both buttons for something. Meanwhile, Masahiro Sakurai made a 1-button game on the GameCube, just for the heck of it. This game is certainly worth checking out, as it's potentially the best maze game on the system, although I think there's one I do like slightly more, which you'll be seeing soon. Yu Yu Hakusho is one of 2 battle shonen that I've thoroughly enjoyed, and luckily us fans of this work have 4 titles on the original Game Boy to choose from. One of which I didn't finish, the 3rd game, because it would glitch out on a certain level, and I wouldn't be able to advance. A real shame because it's the most unique of the 4 games, with actual levels to play and an overworld, while the other 3 are one-on-one fighting games, with so many games thrown in there. But anyway, 2 of these games are on my list, and I'll first be talking about the first game, simply titled Yu Yu Hakusho, the very first video game for this series. This game just follows the Spirit Detective arc, and I gotta be honest, these games might be a bit of a guilty pleasure for me, since I don't actually think they're particularly good as fighting games, and I don't know how much someone, let's say a fighting game fan, who's completely unfamiliar with this work, is going to enjoy this. I like to think you don't need to be a fan of an IP to enjoy a video game adaptation, but for this game especially, I do think I'm a bit biased. Since one of the main reasons I enjoy this game in particular is that Kuwabara, my favorite character in the series, feels especially broken with his lightsaber, Spirit Sword special move, that has ridiculous range and does serious damage, but you do have to charge it up and can only use it for a maximum of 3 times per battle, so I couldn't get through the game just playing as him, and you'll probably need to use all 4 members of the squad, because their health does not replenish between fights. You start with a few items that will allow you to recover, but if you run out of these, you'll have to perform well in the minigames to earn more. This game does have platforms on the stages themselves, yes, predating Smash Brothers, and I found them to be pretty useful for abusing the AI, which I don't feel bad about because if you're familiar with retro fighting games, you'll know that computer opponents often love to cheat, except in Shaq Fu on Game Boy I guess, which you can beat the first time you play it blindfolded, I promise you. Also, these Yu Yu Hakusho games I'm pretty sure have a lot of command inputs that I have no idea how to pull off, since I couldn't find anything online for the controls, so another reason why it's good to abuse the AI by utilizing platforms as much as possible, as well as the game having, well, limited continues. And next is a sequel to the game we were just talking about, which is Yu Yu Hakusho Dai-Ni-Dan Ankoku Bujutsu Kaisen, which covers the Dark Tournament saga, the most iconic arc from the show, although not my favorite. That would have to be the Chapter Black saga, which unfortunately was in the 3rd game on Game Boy, which did not work for me as previously stated. But the Dark Tournament saga probably makes for the best video game material, especially considering they managed to put 14 characters into arcade mode. This is definitely a continuation of the first game using the same formula, although the minigames this time around are actually skill-based, and you've got one more party member, the one and only Genkai. The gameplay itself though is surprisingly different, as it seems to be trying harder to replicate actual fighting games. They've added throws and different buttons for punches and kicks. You can fight outside of the ring, but if you're outside the ring for too long you'll be disqualified, which adds an interesting extra little layer to the bouts. While I do miss the silliness of the first game's gameplay, I like this one very slightly more, due to the superior content and overall polish. Bill & Ted's Excellent Game Boy Adventure A Bogus Journey. Well, I don't know about excellent, but it is quite solid. Unlike Yu Yu Hakusho, I'm not familiar with this IP, and also unlike those games, the graphics here are quite simplistic. If I had to guess what this is supposed to be just based on the graphics, I wouldn't be able to tell you. Well, it doesn't help that I've never seen any of the movies, but yeah, even if I did, I have a feeling it wouldn't help me much. The objective is also simple, which is to collect these shining objects. Will I be reading the box or manual to know what they're supposed to be? Of course not. When you you collect them all, a door will appear that will take you to the next level. But this game actually controls really nicely, and it's a pretty good length at 50 short but sweet levels that provide just the right amount of challenge and variety, as you'll be going from ancient Greece to the shopping mall to hell, all of which of course contain their own unique enemies and obstacles. You have no attack yourself, so it's all a matter of jumping over and dodging everything, making this as much of a puzzle game as it is a platformer. And honestly, puzzle platformers are probably my favorite type of puzzle games, which is likely why I enjoyed this as much as I did. We're going straight to Croc 2, because Croc 1 on the Game Boy Color by Virtuecraft is a pretty terrible game. Interestingly, Croc has had a bit of a resurgence recently, if you can call it that. It received a remastered re-release recently, as pretty much every game is getting remade or remastered nowadays, especially a lot of 3D platformers. And with Croc selling a whopping 3 million on the PlayStation 1, it's not too surprising they do that. Croc 2 on Game Boy Color, though, is pretty much the last new console Croc game, and yes, it did get some mobile releases after this, but no one cares about that. And it's the only Japanese-developed Croc game. But it's not just any Japanese developer. This is Natsume, one of the big boys back in the day, though they're still around under Natsume Atari. More niche, but one of the only developers whose games I actually look forward to, thanks to Tengo Project. While I do think Natsume game design fell off by the mid and late 90s, you could always count on their games at least looking and sounding great, and that is definitely true for Croc 2 here. I think it's fair to say its presentation is among the best on the Game Boy Color. While Croc 1 on Game Boy Color went straight to being a 2D platformer, Croc 2 actually attempts to recreate the 3D platforming style with an overhead perspective, and it actually plays well. Honestly, more 3D platformers getting handheld conversions should have attempted this. We could have seen a style for Rayman 2 on Game Boy Color, for example, but of course Ubisoft was just going to take the easy route, while Natsume was willing to put a bit more care into their games. But that just makes Croc 2 all the more unique. I've actually seen this called the best Croc game by some, although I can't speak on it because my Croc experience is limited to the Game Boy Color, but it's not hard to imagine it may have aged better than those early 3D platformers. The only reason this game isn't higher on my list might be due to faithfulness. I'm more into arcade-style platformers, which Croc is not. This is actually also an adventure game with puzzle-solving elements, and there's a lot of knowing what you need to do or where you need to go. Some might even feel that the player deserves a map, but I still found myself enjoying this one. Shin Megami Tensei Devil Children Kuro no Sho is the first of 3 Megami Tensei titles to appear on my list, and while the Megami Tensei titles on the original Game Boy were trying to be more like Dragon Quest, except Another Bible, which was a tactical RPG, just without the tactics, but yeah, pretty much all RPGs on 8-bit systems were copying Dragon Quest to some degree, but when you get to Game Boy Color, the vast majority of them were chasing the Pokemon formula. I mean, the Game Boy Color has too many Pokemon ripoffs to even count. It felt like I was learning about a new one I didn't know existed every day for a while. I've only played the ones that were available in English, which means I haven't played most of them. But of all the ones I've played, Devil Children here was the only one to make my top 200. Now I know what you might be thinking, what are you doing calling a Megami Tensei title a Pokemon clone when it's the original monster collecting game? Fair question, but they had 2 different versions of this title to encourage trading, and an anime series that spawned over 100 episodes which, unlike Pokemon interestingly enough, came out before the game. Now why would they do that? And also, just like Pokemon, this uses a seamless single-scale map, which of course Pokemon took from Mother, over Dragon Quest multi-scale map that all the RPGs on the original Game Boy like to use. You might be wondering why I put this version of the game on the list over Aka no Sho, and well, that's just because this is the one that had an English patch translation available. And apparently the main difference is just that you play as a boy in this one instead of a girl. Now I should probably mention what I actually like about this game, which is probably the only thing you as the viewer care about, and maybe I shouldn't have spouted all that stuff I just did. I mean, this is the only Pokemon clone to make my list, so I must have done something right? Well, for starters, I really like the presentation. Even just the text boxes look more exciting to me than the standard white text boxes you'd see on about every other RPG on the platform. And the sprite work of the monsters I think was really well done. You'll have to take my word for it that the battle animations are also good. I just turn them off, which I do for every RPG I play, just to make the battles faster. Speaking of which, battle speed is definitely something I value heavily in RPGs, so that I'm not bored and waiting. I feel like most people just play with fast forward on, and overlook this aspect of a lot of RPGs. While you might agree with me that the battle speed in this game is pretty much perfect, and you might just opt to play this game on the normal speed. The encounter rate can feel rather excessive, but it's not too bad when the battles go by so fast. But anyway, what really surprised me is that if you look at the box, this game is actually playable on the original Game Boy, even though to me at least the game seemed way above what the original Game Boy could handle, especially when you compare it to the primitive looking RPGs available on that handheld. It might be an unfair comparison since this game came out in the 2000s, but even Pokemon Gold and Silver, which came out only a year before this in Japan, looks a bit primitive in comparison. And that's probably because those games use only 710 kilobytes of data, while Devil Children here use the entirety of its 1 megabyte cartridge. I also found the monster designs to be quite cute and appealing. The designs of the Megami Tensei monsters have essentially been Pokemonified here, and there's a lot that are completely unique to Devil Children. I already talked about it a bit earlier, but I also much prefer this type of overworld design over what you see in Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy type games. Overworlds that use this multi-scale map all just kind of blend together for me, and I find it to be rather bland. This type of overworld inspired by Pokemon is much more fun for me to explore. This game's got 3 endings, which is neat. Don't want to spoil what that's all about for you though. And there's a bit of post-game. As for what I dislike, there are some solid music tracks in this game. It's a serviceable soundtrack, but it's definitely below Pokemon and many of its clones. I mean, they had Natsume composing both Telefang and Metarot, but most of all, the whole monster fusing process to make your monster stronger, I find to be pretty boring. You see, the only one leveling up from the battles themselves is the main character, who uses a gun by the way, but when it comes to making your monster stronger, it's gonna take a whole lot of fusing, which is something I don't really care for in these types of games, including Dragon Warrior monsters. Although in that it's technically breeding. I just rather get stronger from battles themselves, rather than recruiting monsters just to repeatedly sacrifice them to this blue dog you see on the cover here. And now we have Taiyo no Yusha Fiber GB, based on an anime that you probably actually have seen before, as it's where this image originates. This is a game that has already appeared twice on my channel along with another game, Mega Man 2, once in my Mega Man on Game Boy video, and once in my favorite Game Boy games of 1991 video. Now why is that? Well, these games were both developed by the same team over at Biox, and released on the same exact day, December 20th, 1991. Not so much for Christmas, but probably for all the Japanese elementary school kids who were starting winter break, which probably meant some sweet New Year's money and lots of free time. A demographic both Firebird and Mega Man target. Yeah, Mega Man being made with elementary schoolers in mind may be a hard pill to swallow for all the grown adults today who like to complain about the supposed difficulty and can't play more than 5 seconds without using save states or rewind, but back in the day, difficulty was perhaps the biggest appeal of video games.
Why does Alexander play? Well, there's no one answer, but for most, it's the competition. Everyone wants to be the best. Conquer the challenge.
Practice. You just gotta play a lot.
It's like a challenge, and you feel you have to, you know, finish it.
Best games are the ones that have like a lot of levels, and you can't, you know, pass right away. You have to take a while.
Not that Firebird or Mega Man 2 on Game Boy are difficult games, they're both actually really easy and can be recommended to pretty much anyone regardless of skill, or maybe not, even though it's the easiest Mega Man ever made. Anyway, both these games were definitely rushed to meet that release date though, and the low difficulty might be a symptom of that, but it's most noticeable in the music. Apparently the sound driver, a freelance programmer named Hiroto Nakamura, hired Kenji Yamazaki to handwrite compositions, which turned out great by the way. Unfortunately though, with the short amount of time to work on the game, especially with sound pretty much always being the last thing to be put into games, they weren't so gracefully programmed into the game, and both soundtracks end up being too damn high-pitched, though I still enjoy them. They still have a faint bit of badassery. Anyway, I ought to talk about the actual game here. This is a vertical shmup where you take control of a mech. In the NES version, which looks to be quite similar, I've never played it, but in that version you're able to transform into a ship. In the Game Boy version though, you're on foot all the way through. This seems to be the only shmup on Game Boy like this. I can think of similar games, like Square's King's Knight on NES, but nothing on Game Boy. There's 2 characters you can select, and both these characters have their own speedrun category for this game. But as far as I can tell, it's the exact same game either way all the way through, which may be due to a lack of development time. Maybe they were originally planning for them to be different, but that's all just speculation. But despite the low difficulty, I thought the core gameplay was pretty fun. But honestly, can you really get mad at developers for making an easy game for a brick with a screen you can barely see most of the time? I mean, this game came out years before the Super Game Boy, so it was kinda hard to justify making a punishing, relentless, and sweaty game. Sometimes you just need something fun to play on the go for 15 minutes, whether you're in bed, on the toilet, or in a car, and I do believe Firebird fulfills that purpose.